In the context of Kerala history, one often comes across the story of the breast tax, which even some well-meaning platforms have given currency to. The broad outline is that women, lower caste women, in quotes, in Kerala were not permitted to cover their breasts. If at all they wished to cover their breasts, they would have to pay a specific tax called the Molakaram, or the breast tax. Some go even further, and they say that state officials would go house to house and conduct physical examinations of women in order to determine how much breast tax they should pay. It's a story that keeps popping up on social media, and I thought I would do this video because it's riddled with a number of inaccuracies and misconceptions. To begin with, in Kerala, in general, for the longest time, most women did not cover themselves above the waist. Most Hindu women, at least. Christian and Muslim women tended to, but among Christians, there seem to have been some exceptions at least, because I recently saw a photograph of a Syrian Christian woman also who's not wearing a blouse or an upper garment. So the earliest reference we find to this, and not just limited to lower caste women or marginalized caste women, but elite women also, the earliest reference I have seen is from the 17th century. There was a Dutch commander called Niehoff. I think I'm pronouncing his name wrong, but whatever, that's not the point. He visits in the 1660s the Rani of Koilwan, a woman of royal rank and status. And he writes about this visit, and also there's an image that's been published in books like the Travancore State Manual from that 17th century period. And he talks about how the Rani appears, and she's escorted by 700 soldiers and all of that. She's royal, and she's got a bevy of maids with her. But to his great astonishment, she's topless. She's got a shawl, which, to quote him, she's carelessly thrown over her shoulders, but it's not really covering much, because that's how she dressed. You go a few decades before that, and around 1605, you have Pietro della Valle, the Italian traveler, in the court of the Zamorin of Calicut, in what is now called Kozhikode. And in Kozhikode, in that royal darbar, he encountered two royal princesses, nieces of the Zamorin of Calicut, who had blue loincloths around the waist, but their upper bodies were bare. The queen mother walks in, she's also bare-breasted. Of course, she's got a lot of jewelry, but she's got no garment covering her upper body. In later periods, you have visual references coming in the form of paintings, photographs. So there are two Ravi Varma paintings from the late 19th century. Remember, by the 19th century, new ideas were coming in, exposure to the British, exposure to other parts of India, and women, especially elite women, started feeling that, okay, in certain contexts, we must cover our breasts. So when posing for the painter, you have these two paintings where the subjects, they folded a cloth and held it loosely against the chest, but that's it. You can see that it's a temporary sort of thing kept there because they're in front of the painter. In photographs, some don't even do this. So there's a photograph from the late 20s or approximately 1930 of the then Rani of Cochin, the actual queen of a 17-gun salute major princely state. It's an elderly woman seated in an armchair. She's got a munda tied around her waist, but the upper body is completely bare. 1930, that's how she dressed. Nambudri Brahmin women in traditional dress did not cover their upper bodies. So we have photographs that Madamba Kunyukottan, a well-known personality in Kerala, shared with a PhD scholar who's published it in her dissertation, where you see his family members seated together. And the older women, this is a picture from the mid-20th century, and none of the older women have covered their upper bodies. Like the men are topless, the women are also topless. The younger women, however, are wearing blouses and so on. You see this in some family photos of other elite families also, some Kovilammas, Samanta caste, Cochin royal family members, where you see the same dynamic. Older people are topless, younger people are wearing blouses because perspectives have changed, fashions have changed, and the idea of how women must be covered, specifically women must be covered, has also become different now. So that's, the core point, that covering breasts wasn't something that was a thing in Kerala that upper caste people did and prevented lower caste people from doing. Most women of the Hindu communities did not cover their upper bodies. This, in fact, caused comment relatively early on, and not just from Europeans. In the 17th century, there was this brief instance where between Varkala and Vilamankoda, there was an invading army under a person called Mugilan, which is a Malayalification of Mughal, perhaps. So some kind of invader who had come in, and he had briefly held this territory, and he was scandalized and issued orders that Naya women in this region must cover their upper bodies. And that's how, in that particular region, they start covering the upper body in a certain way. In Travancore, where the Ranis and the court had exposure to Tamil courts, to the British, to Persianate culture, etc., you find that by the early 19th century, the Ranis have created a new garment called the Metagatta or the Molakacha, where just as the mund is tied around the waist, it's also tied around the upper body. But these are exceptions. Even in the Travancore region, most women tended to be topless. So I've seen a photograph of Raja Ravi Varma's sister, also an artist called Manglabai, who's painting, and she's topless in that particular photograph. There's a photograph of the sisters-in-law of the last Maharani of Travancore in the 20th century, and they've got a cloth thrown over the shoulder, but they're not wearing blouses or anything. I have a photo of one of my own Nair great-grandmothers who's got a cloth loosely thrown over her shoulder, but this shoulder and the right side breast are exposed. So that's that. Tipu Sultan, when he invaded North Kerala in the 18th century, he too, or his officials too, were scandalized by seeing elite women walking around topless, and they too are supposed to have issued orders suggesting that these women must now start covering themselves up. So from the 18th century, but particularly into the colonial period, these new values and ideas started coming into Kerala society. In the 19th century, in Travancore, there was something called the Nadar revolts or the Nadar protests, where Nadar women claimed the right to wear what was called the shoulder cloth or the breast cloth, this loose shawl that upper caste women used to wear. Now, most people think this is a protest for these lower caste, marginalized caste women to cover their breasts. That's certainly how missionaries writing about it saw it, because they were coming from a Western perspective, and to them it was barbaric and scandalous that women were not being allowed to cover their breasts, especially those women of Avarna or marginalized communities who had converted to Christianity. So they insisted that they must be permitted to cover their upper bodies. As early as 1812, under the influence of a British officer called Colonel Munro, the Travancore government had permitted Nadar women to start covering their breasts if they so wished. And they were permitted to wear these kupayams, much like this thing I'm wearing, a long tunic or a long shirt or a long blouse. However, these protests continued sporadically for the next several decades. So if the issue was one about covering breasts, the kupayam should have satisfied it. They were wearing tunics, they covered their breasts, issue closed. But it didn't. The issue kept recurring because the point from the perspective of Nadar women was not about covering breasts. In a society where Brahmin women, down to everybody else, used to be topless, covering breasts wasn't a right. They wanted the shoulder cloth because that cloth was a mark of dignity, caste prerogative, caste status, and rank. In fact, even within the Nadar community, you can read the research of Hargrave or Dick Coleman and so on. Even within the Nadar community, there were elite families. So families who collected taxes on behalf of the state, or families who had been recognized by the government as leaders or chiefs of the particular caste. They had the certain special privileges, and their women were permitted to wear the upper cloth. So when ordinary Nadar women started claiming the right to wear the upper cloth, their own social superiors within the same category also objected, because they too saw the cloth as a right of status and their authority and social rank, and not one of covering breasts. So the kupayam wearing Nadar women were often attacked, not because they were wearing kupayams, but because they also added the cloth on top of it. And the cloth was something that they were not supposed to wear because they did not have the caste prerogative. So what's happened is, the missionary gaze that, women must cover their breasts because they are women, oh my God, how can they be topless? That meets a local cultural thing where the claim is anti-caste, where these women are not trying to cover their breasts, they're trying to claim equality with upper caste women. The two sort of get mixed up, and we've got this confused idea that these women were fighting for the right to cover their breasts. So that's that. Finally, this business of the breast tax itself. The breast tax So there's something called a poll tax, which was charged on lower caste communities by the royal regimes of back in the day. Obviously casteist, obviously unfair. Nobody denies any of that. But under this poll tax, each member of that community would have to pay a certain amount to the government. In many places, it was simply called Talapanam or head tax. Tala means head, Panam means cash, or that's your head tax. In some places, evidently, there was a distinction between the rates paid by men and the rate paid by women. And there, Talakaram or Talapanam was the word used for men. And to distinguish women from men, their tax was called Molakaram or breast tax. It had nothing to do with covering breasts. It had nothing to do with, as some stories go, the dimensions of each woman's breasts were to be measured and then the tax would be determined. Firstly, there was no state capacity in those days for government officials to go into every house measuring people's bodies. It simply wasn't possible in those days. And that's not what the tax was about. The tax was an unjust casteist tax, certainly, but other than the nomenclature of being called breast tax, it had nothing to do with breasts. It was purely a way to distinguish men and women. That's the evidence I have seen, at least. So overall, this is a somewhat confused topic, but hopefully this will shed some light on it.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.